Let's begin with a prayer, and we're again chapter 25, first line of chapter 25 of Isaiah. Father, we praise you, we thank you, and we bless you for the gifts you give us. We ask that you would give your protection to people who will be traveling to visit their families during Thanksgiving, and particularly protect those families that will be exposed to COVID by the celebrations. We ask this in the name of Jesus our Lord. Amen. Okay, the next section we're going through in Isaiah is actually a series of psalms. Now, they're Isaiah compositions. They come out of the Isaiah tradition, but they're specifically a group of psalms, and I'll show you the second part of it is theologically a really important one. But anyway, we'll begin. The theological one begins at about verse 6. But anyway, let's start 25:1. O Lord, you are my God. I exalt you. I praise your name, for you have accomplished marvels. He first of all takes the private relationship with God. You know, he doesn't say our God. He says, you are my God. And then he exalts him, he praises him because of the marvels he's accomplished. And there's two ways to look at that. One way to look at it is, if you want to go through the theological thing, you would go through the Exodus, God creation stuff. There's all kinds of stuff. But it's probably best, when you look at the God's accomplished marvels, to take some time to look into your own life and to think about how God has actually touched you one way or another. And I would take that from the beginning. It's if we say, oh God, you are our God, then the marvels that God works are communal. So we would talk about creation, this sort of thing. But when I say he's my God, the question is, what has he done for me? I remember a comedian who was doing a routine on TV, and he was talking about he was Jewish, like lots of comedians, and he was talking to his rabbi about the fact that his faith was getting weak. And the rabbi talked about all the stuff, you know, the Bible, Jonah, the whole business. And when he got all finished, the comedian looked at the rabbi and said, but what's he done lately? And that's actually the question, you know. The question is the greatness of God is not historical. It's supposed to be active. And so, and I don't think there's any doubt that God's working and moving in history. The thing is, how often do we bother to notice it or think of it in terms of God? It's today we celebrate an interesting feast, which is the Feast of Miguel, who was a part of the Christos movement in Mexico. A government came to power in Mexico that was extremely anti-Catholic. And a part of it was, at the time, if you look at the Mexican Revolution to break with Spain, you'll find out the same thing happened there that happened in, let's say, France and a number of places at the time of their revolutions. The revolution in Mexico was actually started by a Catholic priest, and he rang the first bell to inaugurate it and this sort of thing. But consistently, the clergy were with the people and the bishops were with the royalty. And so at the end of it, oftentimes the revolutions took very anti-Catholic positions, but it was really because of the way the bishops tried to move it. It's just like what's going on in the United States today about communion for the politicians and stuff. The bishop, it was very interesting to me when our bishop talked about it. He literally was crying because the way the bishops were acting was so embarrassing to him. And what what one of the guys said to him. He says, the scandal in the Catholic Church in the United States is the bishops. It is the scandal. It's really a strange thing. But anyway, when the revolution got going, the Mexican government would, you could well go to Mass Sunday and find your priest dead in the sanctuary. They would just murder them. The one thing they did is they never allowed the priest to be murdered in clerical clothing. And in Europe, they looked on it, they were presenting it as a political revolution. And Europe, it took them a while to begin to notice it was really focused against the Catholic Church rather than being a political thing. So what they decided to do was they picked out what they thought was the most likely priest, and it was Manuel Pro. And they took him to Mexico City, and they scheduled his execution in the largest bull ring in the city and invited people to come in and see it. And they were convinced that he would admit that it was a political movement in order to save his life. And so they had this big thing all set up and invited reporters from all over the world. And over, I think, about almost an hour and a half, they kept trying to threaten him, and he just didn't respond to their threats. And when, at that point, what could you do? You couldn't just let him go. So they had really no intention of shooting him, but that's what they had to do at that point. And so they, count down. And the second the gun went off, he put out his arms and said, "Viva Cristo Rey." And all these, foreign journalists and everything, everyone snapped a picture. And that picture was all over the world the next day. And it began to wind down the persecution, because then it was very obvious it was a persecution of the church. They had Manuel wearing his Jesuit clericals and everything. So he was the first priest killed wearing clericals and the whole thing. But until Fox was president, I don't know how long ago Fox was president, but until Fox became president, it was against the law to have a copy of that picture in your home in Mexico. And I was never in a Catholic home that didn't have one. Everyone had them, but now, anyway, it's legal. But what I'm getting at in all of this, when Manuel Pro, when we talk about him, we know the type of person he was, and we know why the government thought he would be the one who would cave, and we know why they set the whole thing up. But once in the situation, God worked it. And so Manuel found a strength that was never a part of his life normally, and this powerful thing. But that's the sort of thing, the marvels that God does in individual lives, and to look in our own lives at the marvels he does for us. He says, plans long conceived, faithfully, firmly. And he talks about the marvels of God being these plans that are long conceived. And one of the strange things about being a human being is we have a life. Let's say 100 years would be about a maximum life, but we have a life, and our life is minuscule on the movement of history. And now we know that it moves far beyond history. And how far back do we really reach for? A priest friend of mine, and he just got his DNA done and all this stuff, and found out that there's a percentage of Neanderthal in him. Now that's even, pre-human beings. We have the whole thing, and he was surprised. I told him no one else was. But the idea is that God's plans just extend beyond us in both directions. And I think if you're very lucky, Oftentimes in your life, you have watched certain things that were rotten at the time come to be good, and the results end up being good and this sort of thing. And God's very clear in the scriptures that everything works together for the good of those who love God, ultimately. Okay? But sometimes things take generations to see any value in or any purpose to or anything. So it's a very hard thing. But to understand God's plans are long conceived. And I like to think of God's plans in terms of steps. And you and I know just one step. I know a step. And while I'm on that step, it doesn't look as though it's going up very fast. In fact, at times it looks as though it's kind of going down right now. But I remember a Danish doctor who was giving a talk one time, and he was saying if you take history 100-year increments, you can see progress. So that like every 100 years there's less people enslaved. Every 100 years there's more people educated. Every 100 years that this happens. But in individual things, it's an up and down deal. It's kind of like buying stock. The key is not to play with it, just leave it. So anyway, he says, for you have made the town a heap of stones, the fortified city a ruin. So he's talking about, we went through a list of all the powerful enemies. And they're saying, you look around at those powerful enemies now, and they just aren't there. And it was largely, you see this at a number of instances. I would say that in my life, what really struck me is getting up one morning and find out the Soviet Union had died overnight. That was a fantastic thing. And that these things just come and go. They come and go. Sometimes they're really powerful for a while. And it's I've quoted to you that verse from Bernstein's Mass, where he says, "You people of power, your hour is now. You plan to rule forever. You never do somehow. So we stand in silent treason until reason is restored. We await the season of the word of the Lord." But it's the idea that if you're living through it, it seems endless and powerful and all this, but ultimately it's broken. It takes time. And you might not outlive it. That's the way it works. The citadel of the insolent city is no longer and never will be rebuilt. And so that the destruction of these places are places, many of them, that historically have never risen in power again. Okay? Some of them haven't been even rebuilt at all. Hence, a mighty people will honor you. Pitiless nations hold you in awe. And the idea is what God does to those who completely oppose him causes them ultimately to turn to him. And I guess an example of that would be Paul, who in his life, was a real enemy. But we have a great history in the church of that kind of thing. In the United States, you could have someone like Dorothy Day, who was a militant, powerful communist. And eventually, I don't know if you ever heard the specific thing that converted her. The specific thing that converted her, she was doing a lot of work on the communism thing and the way they felt about religion. And so what she wanted to do was to go into a Catholic church and hear the sermon and look at the congregation, this sort of thing. And she found that when she was in the congregation, she was sitting next to a rather wealthy man, and on the other side was a family that was very obviously homeless. And she saw them all together in the congregation, and when she began to think about it, she said, that was what communism was supposed to do and wasn't doing. But yet in the gathering, that happens in churches. And so this idea that God has a way of touching these people who you would chalk off. We would just chalk off, but not God. He says, "For you have been a refuge for the weak, a refuge for the needy in distress, a shelter from the storm, and shade from the heat. And again, if I look at the whole communism thing, that, if you were one of those who died in the gulag or something, you never saw this. Ultimately, it came, but there are a lot of people who never lived to see this. And I think it's an important thing in going through trials and difficulties with this sort of thing to remind yourself that one day it will be over, whether you live to see it or not. One day it will be over. It says, "For the breath of the pitiless is like a winter storm, like heat in a dry land. You calm the tumult of the insolent. As heat under the shadow of a cloud, so the song of the pitiless is stilled." And obviously in a desert community, he compares God's ability to break this evil to the idea of blocking the sun, which is, that if you've ever been in the Mideast in the summer, you know exactly what they're talking about. So the next part of this is verse 6, and this really, to me, is a powerful section, and it appears also in at least one of the readings during Advent. But anyway, it says, "On this mountain," now the mountain refers to Zion, Jerusalem. "On this mountain, the Lord is preparing for all peoples." I'd like you to notice the term all peoples. When they talk all peoples, they're talking Gentiles. If you're talking the Jews, it's the people of God, or Israel, or Jacob. There are a number of names they use, but it's never the plural peoples. Peoples is those outside, okay? "So you prepare for all peoples a banquet of rich food, a banquet of fine wines, of succulent food, of well-strained wines." And so he goes through this thing. Now, the reference, a banquet of rich food and of well-strained wines, the wealthy people would have these strained wines that were, beautiful in the glass and all this sort of thing. When I was in Italy, one of the things we would go out to these restaurants in Rome, these little tiny restaurants, you find them all over and they're all good. But anyway, we would go into these little tiny restaurants and they all made their own wine. And they would ladle it out and there'd be these little tiny flies all over it because they were in it because it was open to the thing. And that's the way wine was in the ancient world. If you were wealthy, it was strained, and you didn't see any of that. But the thing, I don't know if you're familiar with this glassware that you see comes from Austria, where the top of the glass is clear glass. It gets to be a darker glass on the bottom, maybe red or blue or something, glass on the bottom. That was developed because of the sediment in wine, so that you wouldn't see the sediment when you got the wine, but you could see the beauty of the wine. But very wealthy people, it was well strained and this sort of thing. So not only is this a banquet, this is A-class banquet, okay? It is an A-class banquet. He says, "On this mountain, he has destroyed the veil which veiled all peoples," again, peoples plural, "the pall enveloping all nations. He has destroyed death forever." And the idea, it's a really curious thing to watch the nature of problems in history. But a verse that I really like in the scriptures, it says that justice and peace will kiss. And that sounds beautiful, but if you think about it, every war that has ever taken place has taken place to overcome injustice or to protect ourselves. And every time we have peace, peace becomes a veil to tolerate injustice. So if you look at the history of the United States, we tolerated slavery for a long time because we knew what it would do to the country when slavery was began to be questioned. And it did. We had our Civil War, the worst war we've ever had in our history. And so justice and peace kissing is something that you will never see on the face of the earth. That, we have to establish justice is the argument for a war. And we have to maintain peace is the argument to tolerate injustice. That's the way it goes. But what we see here is that God will somehow destroy the basic thing that causes all this injustice. And the basic thing that causes injustice is death. And basically the fear of death. Now, when I talk about the fear of death, the thing that would ordinarily occur to us is, dying in a hospital or something. But there are all forms of death. If you've ever lost a job, that's a form of death. If you've ever been in the hospital seriously sick, that is a form of death. You're going through that, even though you may recover. And so death has all kinds of things. Think of death as simply being diminishment. Death is whatever diminishes me. So if you're a kid in high school and you fail a course, that's a taste of death. And you get sick, it's a difference between adults. Like if my mother got sick, for instance, it was a rather serious project because then we had to take on taking care of her, and then my dad had to take on cooking. We were lucky to live through that. And so you have that thing. When you get sick as a kid, it's very different. When I got I think it was the mumps, I got to move from my bedroom downstairs to upstairs to my parents' bedroom downstairs because it was easier for my mother to take care of me. No, it was when I had my tonsils out and I lived on ice cream. Now, that's a taste of death. I don't understand it. Okay? But the idea is that the fear of death is what causes all the problems on the face of the earth, and death in its many forms. If we're not afraid of those things, then it's gone. And see, what Jesus wanted to let us know is that death, ultimately, he's defeated. And all of death, not just, the physical death, the end of your life. Jesus has defeated disease. He's defeated diminishment. He's defeated things that insult you. He has defeated death. And you look about, I oftentimes hear this with regards to Last Judgment. As a kid, I don't know if you were trained with this, but as a kid, Last Judgment was like a public trial. And the whole universe was going to sit there and see everything you did wrong in your life. I want you to know that as a priest who listens to confessions, if we have to sit and watch everything wrong with everyone's life, we'll all die again of boredom. Flat out, we'll just all die of boredom. But the idea is, if that's the way Last Judgment is, don't you think you'd be embarrassed in heaven every time you saw someone who saw that side of your life? But the fact is that would be a diminishment. So that's not there. There is no diminishment. All those are things of death. And if he destroys death, then the fear of death goes with it. And the fear of death is the real serious problem, and he destroys it. God has wiped away the tears from every cheek. He has taken his people's shame away over all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. Okay? So he talks about God's done this, and then he specifically reiterates that he's taken away his people's shame. And that refers to the Jews, okay? And why does he do this? Because the shame of the world in general, we know about it and all this kind of thing, but the Jews hold a document of their shame. And so it's very important they're eliminated from that. So that this idea that we hold the scriptures, well, the scriptures tell us of the infidelity of the Jews and the things they did. So it's documented. So he takes a very specific stand that they are freed from that. That will not be a dishonor to them at all. He says, on that day it will be said, look, this is our God. In him we put our hope that he would save us. Okay? So, first of all, this is our God. We're talking about the peoples again. Here, God is acknowledged as being the God of everyone. Ultimately, he is everyone's God. Okay? And in him we put our hope. And our hope is that ultimately God will save us. And that save us from the death, the fear of death, everything. Save us from sin. God ultimately saves us, period. It says, this is the Lord. We waited for him. Let us exult and rejoice in his salvation. And this idea of waiting for him in Israel, the whole history of Israel is founded on waiting and preparing for the Messiah. And it begins in the story of Genesis when God promises Adam and Eve a deliverer from the sin. And it moves right through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The whole thing is all waiting for this one individual to be produced. It says, for the Lord's hand will rest on this mountain. Okay? And again, it's Israel. It'll be this mountain that will draw all people together. He says, and then he goes on, and Moab will be trodden underfoot as straw is trodden into the dung heap. And this idea of treading straw into the dung heap, animal dung was one of the ingredients in making bricks. And so you would add the mud, the dung, and the straw. The straw helps to bind it. And so when they would make bricks, this is the way it was done. He says, Moab will stretch out his hands in the midst of it, like a swimmer stretching out his hands to swim. But his pride will be humbled, whatever his hands may attempt. Okay? So his pride will be humbled so that whatever he attempts really isn't going to happen. And they mention this, I've told you before, Moab was never really powerful enough to conquer Israel, but anytime Israel was conquered, or anytime Israel was weak, Moab would raid, and so was a constant enemy in that way. The impregnable fortress of your walls he has overthrown, laid low to the ground in the dust. Okay? And now we go into a song, another one of these psalms, but this one of thanksgiving. That day, this song will be sung in Judah. Ours is a strong city. He set up the salvation of walls and ramparts. Open up the gates that the righteous people may come in, a people that keeps faith. So he decides, he's talking about Israel. Israel's been made very powerful while these outside areas have been conquered. And then he says that having been made very powerful, they will open their gates so a righteous people may come in. And the idea is that these places, having been punished by God, repent. And then they come in as a righteous people to join Israel. We would see this as a prophecy that was fulfilled with the Gentiles that were converted in the church. We oftentimes think of the Catholic Church as a Gentile church, but that's because there are more Gentiles than Jews in the community. But the fact of the matter is it's a Jewish church. It descends right from Israel for that community. The early founders were Jewish and everything. So this idea is that we were welcomed in to this Jewish community. And I should also mention that this was one of the things that John the 23rd quoted in the council, that the council was to be one that understood the power of the church. And understanding the power of the church, you don't need to protect yourself from people. You can welcome people in because the church is powerful enough in teachings and everything that the church can stand. One of the things that I think is very interesting is how many people today don't listen to other sides of an issue. And to me, that's always an indication that if you will not listen to the other side of an issue, you're afraid they might be right, which is why you don't listen to them. But a sane person listens to all these things and maybe alters their view or changes it. You know, you'd think if I'm wrong, I want to know it. Not that I want to protect myself from ever finding out I'm wrong. And I think, yeah, I'm like Cardinal Newman, that to grow is to change, to be perfect is to have changed often. The fact is that none of us is perfect. And so we have to be people who are willing to change. You know, if we aren't willing to change, we get further from perfect every day, move further away. He says, those of trustful mind you will keep in peace because they trust in you. And the idea here is that the source of peace is to be the trust in God. That's where the peace comes from. In theology, we study the virtue of hope. Hope is the expectation that the future will work out. But the danger is when everything is going really well, we actually have optimism. And if something goes wrong, optimism is destroyed. Hope is not destroyed if something goes wrong, because it's a hope in God who holds the future. It's not a hope in the way things appear to be going. It says, so he says, trust in the Lord forever, for he, the Lord, is a rock of ages. He has brought low the dwellers on the heights, and the lofty citadel he lays low. He brings it to the ground, flings it in the dust. It will be trampled underfoot by the feet of the oppressed, the steps of the poor. And again, it's just a reminder to us of things that seem so powerful in the world, and they really are not, you know, over a period of time. There can be movements, there can be, in our own day, I think it's technology, but things appear so powerful at one time, but they're just things. Everything has its age, you know, these are just things. The way of the righteous is level. You smooth the path of the righteous. And one of the things that I think is interesting, do you remember that when Satan was trying to tempt Adam and Eve with the apple, one of the things that Satan said is, it'll give you the knowledge of good and evil. And being made in the image of God, Adam and Eve had no knowledge of evil. They had only a knowledge of good. And with only the knowledge of good, you kind of know what you're supposed to do. It's not a big discussion. Like, you know, I get really angry at a person. Should I just walk away? Should I attack the person? Should I forgive the person? Well, you know, if you're a believer, you'll ask, do I walk away or do I forgive the person? That you might ask, but you aren't going to ask the other one at all. And life becomes much smoother. It's like when many of the saints as martyrs have, like Thomas More during his trial, said, just get it over with. He says, I know what you're going to do. And he said, you should know what I'm not going to do, which is, you know, approve of the divorce. So he said, why don't we just get this over with? And the fact of the matter is, a good person actually has a lot less choices to make. So it's an easier path. That you come up to the thing, you don't consider the options. You consider, you know, following this. It's very, very simple. O Lord, we wait for you. Your name, your memory are all our soul desires. And this, the memory being the only thing the soul desires, is to really keep in mind all that God has done. To keep in mind his power, keep in mind the way he acts, keep in mind the way he deals with people. I think one of the things I've become convinced of over a period of time is that when people are being martyred, there's some way in which God protects them so that they don't feel it the way it looks like it feels. And I don't really know how that happens or anything, but if you study the lives of martyrs, and particularly modern martyrs who people watch to die, like Maximilian Kolbe or people like that people really watch, or Teresa Benedicta too, that people actually saw them die, that they die in peace and this sort of thing. And that's, you'd think you'd be overcome by the particular pain of the process of dying, but many of them don't. You may remember this line if you ever saw the movie Quo Vadis. I'm always careful about quoting things because they can be very archaic in today's world. I was talking to a woman on the phone the other day, and I needed a phone number, and she said, I can give it to you. And I said, I'll look it up in the phone book. She says, what's a phone book? I thought they left them free at everyone's door. But anyway, so this idea in Quo Vadis, they go out to get the bodies, of the remains of the Christians. And Nero says, why are they all smiling? The fact of the matter is that was a major thing during the persecutions, the way the Christians reacted and the way Christians went through martyrdom. It was just remarkable. And there has to be some way God protects people. It's just, I probably have told you this story, but when I went back to, I was the keynote speaker at a gathering where they were preparing for the canonization of Godly Tequitha. And so I gave the talk. But anyway, we did that back in Washington, and we visited the areas that were important to her life. And one of the places we went to was, she was in a Mohawk village down here and didn't want to be baptized in her own village. The Mohawks were, as a group, kind of anti-Catholic. And so she went up to another Mohawk village so she could be baptized in that village and then come back to the Mohawks. The Mohawks had to relate well and to allow Catholics around because that was part of the Indian Confederation against the British. And so they had to do that. But they weren't very fond of Catholics. So she went up to be baptized. And she went into the longhouse. And now the longhouse isn't there, but the foundations of all the longhouses are in that area. And she would go to the center of the house, which is where they had a large fire, and that's where people gathered. And then they slept along the edges of the place. So anyway, she went there and she was baptized, and she was actually on the very spot where the North American martyrs were all killed. And when I was looking at it, I was thinking to myself, what a wonderful thing if while those men were being martyred, God showed them Kateri's baptism and her canonization in Rome. And I think that could be done. And then, while you're going through that, you could see that ultimately you win. They're going to kill you, you're going to die, but ultimately you win. The faith's established. So, but whatever way, God, in my watching of martyrdom and reading accounts of it, I'm convinced that there's something God does. I don't know what it is. At night, my soul longs for you, and my spirit within me eagerly seeks you. For when your judgments appear on earth, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. And the idea is that the judgments of God, if they're carried through, this idea of learning righteousness, the judgments of God are verified by the fact they work. So that it would be logic if we, we're really upset with someone, it would be logic that if we would get even, there'd be less chance they'd bother us. But actually that doesn't work. It never has worked. And it's illogical that you should forgive them, because if you forgive them, they just do it again. And yet forgiveness often works. And that's like the judgment of God. To listen to the judgments of God, because from God we learn righteousness. And the basic attitude that's held in the philosophers, you don't see this so much in Jewish literature, but in the philosophers, God created the universe, and therefore he knows how the universe works. And so when God gives us his rules, the rules God gives us are given to us so that this world can work, because he who made it knows how it works. A similar example of the same type of thing, when they opened the new cathedral in Los Angeles, they had several days for people to come. There was one day musicians would come, and but one of the days was for artists. And the bishop, each bishop got 2 invitations, so he gave them to me. And I took another priest with me, another artist as well. And we went, and one of the really interesting things there is when you went through, there's a lot of art in the new cathedral. But the artist who created each piece was at that piece. And so you'd go over to like the tapestry, and the artist who actually created it was there. And you could ask questions, explain it. And he knew more about it than, anyone at all, and would point out things in it that you didn't notice. So this sort of stuff. I remember particularly that there are 2 people in the tapestry without halos. And they're both children. And one's a little boy with a skateboard, and one's a little girl in a Catholic school uniform. And he said they represent future saints. And the whole idea is that the creator of it can point out things that would never, ever occur to you. Just never, ever. That's one of the reasons, incidentally, that Michelangelo's works are so famous, is because Michelangelo kept heavy, heavy journals. And so we can read a lot of what Michelangelo was about and stuff. My most favorite quote from the journal in one of the church, I think it's in Mary Major, but one of the churches in Rome is a statue he did of Moses. And he describes that when he finished the Moses, he thought it was such a magnificent carving that he took the hammer and hit the knee and asked Moses to speak. That it was so powerful when he saw it, he expected it to speak. So, he says, if mercy is shown to the wicked without their learning righteousness, the wicked will act wrongly in the land of right conduct and not see the majesty of the Lord. So what he's saying here is that God must withhold mercy until we learn our lesson, until I realize where wickedness goes. And then when I realize that this is the path I can't pursue, that's the decision I have to make. And then God opens his path before me. It's sort of like alcoholism. If you're an alcoholic, you need to make the decision that this isn't working and I'm going to stop drinking. Once you make that decision, another path opens to you. But you don't see the alternatives while you're involved in any kind of addiction. Okay? So he says, "O Lord, your hand is raised, but they do not yet see. Let them be ashamed when they see your care for your people, and let the fire descend for your enemies to consume them." And the idea here is they should see the righteousness of God in the way God cares for the people that are following God's law, and how life works for the people who follow God's law. And again, I think I mentioned some of this last time. One of the major things about the Jews is their ecological rules. There's a lot of things in Jewish tradition that have to do with ecology. And their land went very well under this law because they followed the law. I mentioned to you about the way you harvest and that sort of thing. They're all very strict, but they all have amazing benefits. And if you're, like for instance, if you're a typical American, you say, if we harvest the full field and then go over the second time with the stuff that wasn't ripe the first time, we will make more money, which is true. But if you do it the Jewish way, you have to round the corners so that wild birds have a place to nest. And you can never pick up a second thing. So if the tomatoes that weren't ripe when you went through, they're for poor people. You leave them there, let them ripen, they glean them. Okay? So the idea is that these people should be, should be converted. I want you to understand the use of fire here. When fire is used, it can have a number of meanings, but one of the major meanings for fire with the Jews was purification. If you were to take, like anything that was not combustible, like eating utensils that might be metal, most of them were wood, but if they were metal, they were purified by fire. Bowls that were out of clay and stuff, they're always purified by fire. And remember, gold was refined by fire, that everything, that fire was seen as the great purifier. And so when, that we say that if you're, like one of the passages in Jesus' teachings, that if someone's really mean to you, be nice and forgive them, you'll heap fires of coal on their head. It makes it sound like you're getting even. But what it is, you're purifying them, that ultimately will purify them. So, O Lord, you will grant peace, and you will grant peace to us. For all we have achieved, you have done for us. And this, I think that this is the, what do I want to call it? This is the guard against pride in human life, is to realize the gifts you've received. You may have a very high position, be a very important person, and yet if you look back, you were lucky genetically, you were lucky in schools, you were lucky. Just go through a whole bunch of things. And always to be aware that our gifts, the great and wonderful things, are in fact gifts. Okay? Everything is a gift. And the one benefit is that we didn't refuse them, okay? So that we get credit for. But everything is gift, and to realize this. But if you understand it is a gift, then it doesn't matter how high you see it, okay? And I think some people, think that the way to be humble is to deny the things you can do and stuff, and that's crazy. The way to be humble is to admit the gifts you have come from God, the powers you have come from God. O Lord our God, other lords have ruled us, but your name alone do we invoke. The dead will not come back to life. The shades will never rise again, for you have punished them, destroyed them, wiping out even their memory. Okay? And again, is this the loss of the people? Theologians say that's not the way it's meant. It's the loss of what they were about. Let me take the Holocaust with the Jews. Imagine what has to happen and how long the Jews have to be removed from the Holocaust for the unbelievable pain of it to begin to diminish. But God says that can be done. That can be done. God can build up his people. He can move them away from the things that have happened. And so that ultimately these things are not seared into people's memories. You have increased the nation, Lord. You have increased the nation and won yourself glory, for you have enlarged all the frontiers of the land. And basically he's saying all this stuff that's happened, the end of our enemies and stuff, that's all your work, and you have done it, and they acknowledge it. Okay? We'll call it there. That's 26:16. We'll pick it up next time.